Hello to everyone. I'm in the north side right now. I actually live in Worthington, so coming out across the city at you. Hello, Joanna. Hopefully, everyone is surviving in these crazy times. All right, it's pretty exciting to have the opportunity to bring the Columbus Noir book to everyone, even though all of our events got postponed, not canceled. So hopefully, later on this year we will be able to get out to our awesome independent bookstores, all of that. But in the meantime, this is a pretty good medium, I guess, right? So we can still talk about books, we can talk about crime. You really can't ask for anything else. Hey, Daniel. Hey, Andrew. So glad that so many of you could join today. It has been crazy weather. It's really good weather for staying inside, right? Like, it was snowing a little bit ago. It's April. Does anyone realize that? Like, the snow should be over. Um, but I guess we're alive. We're here, and that's good. So, I guess I will get started talking about Columbus Noir. Hopefully you all have your copy. If not, this is what it looks like. I am obsessed with this cover photo. It was taken by Jacqueline Fisher of Coley & Co., who is also the same photographer who did my headshots a couple years ago. So she's a great local photographer if you are ever in the need for photos, and if life as we know it ever resumes, which I'm hoping that it does, right? So let's talk about Columbus Noir. I'm so excited that I have a story in this book. When Andrew Welsh Huggins, our editor, approached me about it, I could not have been more enthusiastic about saying, yes, yes, oh my gosh, yes. I've loved this series from Akashic books for a long time. There's some really great entries. New Orleans Noir is a favorite of mine. I also really love Prison Noir, which is edited by Joyce Carol Oates. It's really fantastic. I see there Andrew says snow in April equals noir. I agree. That is very noir. So I'm glad Mother Nature is playing along. It's a noir is kind of like it's a tricky to define genre. I think last week, if you were here for Andrew's talk, he did a great job explaining what noir is. I like to think that it's more of a tone than a genre by itself, because you can have a crime story that is a noir story, but not all crime stories are noir stories, and conversely, not all noir stories are crime stories. You can really kind of play with the edges, but they have some elements in common, of course. And I think regardless of whether there's a crime or violence in a noir story, the characters in the story are basically making the wrong decision at every single moment. I think in that way, we can all probably feel like we've been in a noir story of sorts at some point in our lives. But basically, characters in a noir story, they make bad choices and they find themselves in impossible situations, usually of their own making. So you can tell a story like that in any genre according to the way we like shelve books at a bookstore. You can have a mystery story, of course, but there is plenty of sort of mainstream fiction that doesn't involve crime that has that same like just gritty, edgy, difficult people in difficult situations type of feel. And I think it's a wonderful place to start with storytelling. It's a lot of fun. So anyway, when Andrew first talked to me about this book, I believe it was in 2016. So it was before my novel, my debut novel, The Last Place You Look, had even come out. And I didn't know anything about anything, which I still don't, honestly. But I was very new to the whole world of publishing. But I was so excited about the idea. Like, of course, Columbus should have a Columbus Noir. it's a great city for writing mysteries. It's a great city for writing about in general. And we have like all of the right elements for telling this type of story. We've got big city problems. We've also got, cornfields right outside of town. And there's like a lot of interesting tension that pops up with that kind of thing. We have crime, of course. Any crime writer knows that that's the essential element in a crime story. But in a noir story, you can play with the edges a little more. It doesn't have to be quite so, whodunit-y. It's not, the point of a noir story is not to solve a crime. It's really to just let the story unfold and tell it. So I was super excited to be asked to be a part of it. I was also really excited to suggest some other writers to be included. And then it was time to actually write the story, which, if you haven't ever written a short story before, it's really hard. It's actually a lot harder than writing a novel, in my opinion. It's much easier to write an entire book than it is to write a short story. And the reason is because, like, a short story is not just like a mini novel. It's like, it's not just a short piece. It has to have the entire thing just sort of compressed, and you have to be really efficient with your choice of language. You have to be really economical with your words and with your plotting. You don't have time to include tons and tons of backstory for all of your deeply complicated characters. And that's a real hard thing for me to deal with because I love to write backstory. So that's probably my favorite thing to write. So writing a short story, you really have to get in quickly, get to the point, and sketch out characters in just a couple lines. So writing the story was pretty challenging. And I actually, my private investigator protagonist in my series, Roxanne Weary, she lives in the neighborhood that I chose for Columbus Noir. She lives in Old Town East. And at first I thought, I'll write a Roxanne Weary story. But what I was really struggling with was this idea of like a private investigator story has to have a sort of satisfying wrap up with the solution to the mystery that's like, it's like a puzzle. You need that in order for it to like be satisfying. And writing a short story that contains all those same elements as a book, but without the space, that was just, it was really tough. So I wound up starting and stopping quite a few different stories, more than one or two or three or four, I think 5 or 6 maybe, before I finally realized what I wanted to do with this story. And so let's talk about Old Town, right? If you are not familiar, it is one of Columbus's oldest neighborhoods. Some of the homes date back to 1830, which is a very long time ago. It's got beautiful architecture, huge houses with huge front porches. It's very distinct. And it's also one of those places where people who aren't familiar with a neighborhood can sometimes do that thing where they're like, isn't it dangerous there? And what that usually means when white people say it is, isn't that a predominantly black neighborhood? They kind of like say it really like it's code, right? And it's absurd, of course. But I used to live there, and that's the kind of reaction that I got from people when I told them where I live. They'd be like, is it safe? And even now, which this is, 10 years after that, if you Google Old Town East Columbus, one of the top results is it safe? I wish that wasn't true, but it is. And the fact is, like, yes, Old Town East is safe. Also, nowhere is really safe. I mean, you have to keep your wits about you no matter where you are in this world. The world is a dangerous place. So in that way, like, it's a silly question, but it's just as safe as anywhere if you are mindful of your surroundings. So, like, it would always kind of bother me when people I knew, like coworkers who knew where I lived, would be like, oh, I don't go to Old Town, but they would have no problem going to the Short North, which has far more street crime than Old Town ever has. It just doesn't make any sense, but the Short North is a neighborhood that has fully gentrified, whereas Old Town has been in the process of gentrifying for some time, and it is not it hasn't quite gotten there, but it's always trying for it, I think. And I was thinking about this earlier, like the neighborhood of Franklinton, it kind of like leapfrogged right over Old Town in terms of like the next neighborhood in Columbus to become the hip neighborhood. Old Town was in this, it was on deck, but it didn't happen. That's changing a lot. I think there's a lot of new development going on there, tons and tons of new apartments, and it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. But it's a great neighborhood to live in. I lived there for several years. My partner Joanna lived there for many years, although we didn't know each other at the time. It's a great place to live. It's good for people watching. It's good for walking around, and as far as it being safe, I never felt unsafe when I lived in Old Town. I had my car broken into way more times in Clintonville than I ever did in Old Town. And furthermore, I think a neighborhood can only be as safe as the people who move there are smart. So if you have some real dumbasses moving to your neighborhood, that's going to change the dynamic. If you have people who are bringing a lot of problems with them move into your neighborhood is going to have those problems. And that was really where I kind of started with this story. I wanted to play with this idea of, people who move to Old Town for the beautiful architecture. They buy these gigantic houses for relatively inexpensively if they are not in good shape, and then, work on the house, rehab it. It's kind of like, it's a thing that a lot of people are interested in doing. People who are maybe more interested in the aesthetics of a thing, not interested in the neighborhood itself. And people like that, when, you move into a neighborhood, you're bringing your problems with you. And so for the characters in my story, which is called Gun People, the bad neighborhood element ultimately is them. They're the ones who are bringing the trouble. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read to you a little bit from Gun People, and then I will be happy to answer some questions. All right, this is Gun People. It turned out that Anya had zero aptitude for home improvement. The mess of it, the dry chemical stink, the 2,000 hexagonal shower tiles that had to be placed with such exhausting precision, it was nothing like the HGTV shows she loved, edited as they were into palatable chunks. The real-life version was noisy, full of loose nails and cracked plaster, and even 3 months into the process, their beautiful ruin of a house still resembled a before photo of itself more than any kind of after. Her husband, calm, patient Eli, was in his element, his mathematical brain perfectly suited to the tedious task. He reveled in a job well done in straight lines and right angles. He was surprisingly adept with tools for a rangy, bookish accountant. But it had all been her idea, joining the ranks of the Old Town East gentrifiers, rescuing a condemned Queen Anne on Bryden Road, and restoring the house to its 19th century glory. Why had she ever thought this was a good plan? She was sick of it after the 2-month mark. The part that Anya was interested in, the selection of paint colors and furniture and the right style of curtains, was ages away. It embarrassed her that after all this, what she actually wanted was to go shopping. But by the time she realized it, what was there to do? Suggest they abandon everything and move back to the suburbs? Her friends had been telling her she'd made a mistake, a series of mistakes, really, and she wasn't about to prove them right. They'd met in the jewelry store, where she worked after college, her fashion design degree collecting dust, when he came in to buy a gift for his niece. He wasn't her type. He was a good 10 years older than her, she guessed at the time. 15, it turned out. With tortoiseshell glasses and hair threaded with gray, but he radiated a calm, solid confidence that she found unexpectedly charming. He returned the next week to ask her to dinner. She liked that he didn't come in with a pretense, didn't ask her without actually asking the way men did sometimes, "What are you doing later?" Or a directive instead of an invitation, "Get dinner with me." Or couch the invitation in self-deprecation to make her say yes out of pity. She fell for him fast, or maybe with the way he made her feel, with the version of her that he saw. Sophisticated, smarter, more interesting than she really was. He didn't play games or make things unnecessarily complicated, and she always knew where she stood with him. And the sex was good. It was. So sometimes he could be a little too careful with her, like he was polishing a violin. and he was fast asleep by 10 o'clock most nights, and he subscribed to 3 different newspapers and read them all every day. But in the interest of finally deciding what kind of life she was going to lead, she could deal with that. He wanted her to have everything she wanted, and in that way, they were perfect for each other. The problem was, she had never really known what she wanted herself. The trouble really started in February. She dropped a hammer on her right foot, fracturing 2 metatarsals. The doctor in the emergency room at Grant Hospital gave her the big blue shoe and said she was to avoid putting any weight on it for 6 to 8 weeks. That meant 6 to 8 weeks more in the half-done house, or longer. Tax season was ramping up for Eli, and his longer hours at the office meant less progress anyway. And now this. She became slightly hysterical at the thought. Eli rubbed her back while she cried, the first time she had done so in his presence in the 2 years they had been together. He said, "Listen, I know we said we wanted to do all of the renovation work ourselves, but maybe we can bring some contractors in, just to keep the ball rolling while you're laid up." "You won't be disappointed?" Anya said. Nah, he kissed her temple. He was so decent that it could irritate her a little. "The important thing is we're in this together." That was her last chance, she realized after what happened, to tell him the truth. But instead, she nodded and tucked her head into his shoulder and just let him take care of things. Eli hired a crew called Well Built to take over. There were 4 of them, 2 college-age kids always plugged into their headphones, a grizzled old guy who chewed tobacco like gum, and the foreman of the crew, Steve. The energy drinks they consumed each day left an alarming quantity of crushed cans in the trash, which Anya moved to the recycling bin each evening. She emptied the coffee mug they used as an ashtray. Otherwise, she avoided the men, holing up in her office, which, while small and plain, was the most intact room in the entire house. She was creating pattern flats for Abercrombie, freelance, a boring process that made her brain itch, restless for a creative outlet. The renovation was supposed to be that outlet, but it wasn't. Sometimes she took a break and tried to sketch something new, a dress she might wear at the open house they would throw once this nightmare was completed, but nothing came to her. There was a blank white square in the center of her imagination, like she'd stared directly at an eclipse. It was during one of these breaks when Steve knocked on her office door. "Excuse me, miss, the power's going to flick off for a minute here. Just wanted to let you know." As he spoke, the door slowly ticked open from the force of his knock. "Oh," he said, taking in the blue foam shoe. She'd been behind a sewing table the last few times he'd seen her. "Okay, thanks," she said. Steve stayed where he was and nodded at her foot. "Let me guess," he said. "It happened when you fell from heaven?" It was the most ridiculous thing anyone had ever said to her, and she laughed out loud, a harsh, sudden cackle that seemed to startle both of them. Then she felt bad, even if she tried to struggle to keep from laughing again. "You nailed it," she said. "Thought so," Steve said, doubling down instead of melting into the hallway from embarrassment. He was short, not much taller than Anya, but sturdy and muscular, his features almost hidden entirely under a baseball cap and behind a neat dark beard. Then he winked, like maybe he was in on the joke after all, and pulled the door closed behind him. After that, he started stopping by her room to tell her something each day. They were turning the boiler off for a while. They were ordering Jimmy John's for lunch. Did she want anything? It became a welcome distraction from the blank white square. Her friends would not come to visit her here, citing the street crime. Indeed, her college roommate Leslie had her car broken into the one and only time she did venture into Old Town, but that was mostly her own fault for leaving an iPad sitting on the passenger seat in full view, a bad idea in any neighborhood. And sure, there were occasional muttering strangers in the alley behind the house, and every so often a series of pops that might have been a gunshot or a car backfiring. It was impossible to say. The area felt safe enough to Anya. No one had ever bothered her on the street, not like when she lived in the short north and was accosted at least twice a day by panhandlers. But she hadn't gone outside in a week. She wasn't allowed to drive yet, and the city was frozen in snowy gridlock. Bryden Road seemingly one of the last streets to get plowed for some reason. Eli had cleared their sidewalk, but the houses on either side of theirs had not. Where would she go? The porch? Eventually she tried it, bundled herself up in 2 coats and a quilt she made in high school. "What on earth are you doing out here, hun?" Steve said when he found her there. "It's 15 degrees, though he was wearing a t-shirt and didn't seem to be cold. I just needed a change of scenery. Cabin fever. I've been stuck in there for too long." He looked up at the house, its towering 3 stories. Castle fever, more like. "I'm going to run over to the Ace Hardware on Parsons if you want to come, just to get out for a bit." That would be great, actually. She was able to hobble down the steps on her crutches, but when it came to hoisting herself up into his massive truck, she required assistance, unable to stand on her right foot long enough to step up into the cab with her left, unable to do the opposite either. "Here," Steve said, "just here." He grabbed her by the hips and lifted her easily, as placing a dish on a shelf. Anya was a little shocked that he was that strong, that he touched her like that without asking if it was okay. He tucked her crutches into the back seat and slammed her door closed. The inside of the truck smelled like smoke and paint. She stared straight ahead as he got in and drove away from the house. Her face was hot, but she didn't know why. Then he said, "So how come your dad doesn't take you places?" Anya cringed. "Oh God, this has been a mistake. My dad? No, he's my husband." Steve raised an eyebrow. "How'd a guy like him land a fox like you?" "This is inappropriate, I think," Anya said. Had she encouraged him by letting him flirt with her out of boredom? Had she accidentally flirted back? "I'm just messing with you," he said, shooting her a wink. She waited in the truck while he went into the store, pressing her cold hands to her cheeks to cool them. She was embarrassed on his behalf, but also, just barely, she felt a tug of desire. Was this what happened when she spent too much time on her own? When they returned to the house, he hopped out first and came around to her side and scooped her up. "My crutches," she said. "Oh, right." Still balancing her against him, he reached easily into the back seat to grab them. Anya gasped when she felt a sudden hardness pressing into her thigh. "What? Oh my," she said, grateful when the crutches were in hand and she could step away from him. But then she saw what she'd felt. A gun, holstered to his hip, just the bottom of it sticking out from under his t-shirt. And some small part of her was disappointed, and she was ashamed, and then profoundly intrigued. Steve saw her looking and lifted up the hem of his shirt. "What did you think it was?" "I didn't... Nothing. But why? Why do you have a gun?" "This isn't a good neighborhood, darling," he said. "A bunch of rich people trying to fix up these old mansions doesn't change that." That night, eating Chinese takeout from the place on Broad Street, she asked Eli, "Have you ever fired a gun?" He twirled a noodle around his chopsticks. "I can't say that I have. Why?" "I was just wondering," Anya said. He shrugged and went back to the Wall Street Journal. "I was wondering," she went on, "if we should get a gun in the house." He put down his newspaper in surprise. "I don't think you and I are gun people, are we?" "Not for fun, like for safety," she said. "Safety?" Eli stared at her, eyes growing concerned behind his glasses. You feel unsafe here?" "Well, no," she said. "A gun doesn't make anyone safer," Eli said. "No, I know, never mind. I was just asking. I think a lot of people around here do have guns." "What people?" "If anything, more guns mean less safety. Percentage-wise." Eli continued, but she tuned him out, realizing she didn't have the vocabulary for what she was trying to say. So that is where I will stop. That is Gun People, and it is not much of a spoiler to report that that's not the end of the gun discussion in their household. So I am happy to answer any questions if anyone has them. You can just type them in the comment box. One question that I get a lot is about my writing routine, which right now, like, everyone's routines are broken. Nothing makes any sense. So that's really kind of a struggle as a writer to develop a good routine. I'm still in the process of figuring out what my new routine is going to be. But the good thing about writing is that you can always do it from home. And also, us writers are used to being recluses a lot of the time. So in that way, the whole social distancing thing isn't a huge deal. See a question here. What is my work in progress? So I am working on my 5th book, which is called One of Those Girls, and it is not part of my series. It is going to be a crime novel with 3 narrators, and it is about a young woman who goes missing after going to a haunted hayride with her youth group. And it's told from the point of view of a detective investigating her disappearance, one of her teachers, and then also from the missing girl herself, but a year in the past. So that has been a lot of fun to write something that's really very different than what I've been used to writing for the last couple years with my series. It's going pretty well. So Andrew would like to know, what are you reading right now? I haven't been reading very much. It's hard for me to read fiction when I am on deadline. I have been reading the news a lot, and I've also been doing a lot of other activities like crafting. I've been sewing face masks and knitting and stuff like that. So I'm looking forward to finishing my draft of this new book so I can get back to reading. Let's see, Tom would like to know, how have your book promotions changed with COVID-19? Well, this whole, social distancing, isolation situation has changed everything for everybody, I think. Tons of our Columbus Noir events were postponed. And then there's some big stuff like the Ohio Anna Book Festival, which was supposed to be sometime in the next couple weeks. That's been, moved out. So a lot of the events that I had scheduled for the spring and early summer have been moved. So, those are really, writers look forward to things like Ohio Anna because it's an opportunity to get in front of readers and talk to them directly. And it's always a lot of fun. So without that, it kind of feels like, I don't know what I should be doing, but I've been doing some, things like this, book clubs through Zoom or whatever. So it's a lot of taking book promotion stuff and making it online, which is, it's fine. I've always done some things remotely. Like when I've talked with book clubs, I've done it by Skype before, just not usually events that are here in town with me. But, I think it's good in the way of making things more accessible for people, and it's just going to change the way that we, think about how we do this stuff. But it's really discouraging. Bookstores are closed. Amazon isn't prioritizing books. It's a little bit scary as a writer. We don't really know what's going to happen. And in 6 months, when we find out about how our books were doing, then we'll know. Let's see. Mindy would like to know, are we getting more Roxanne? Well, there is a new Roxanne Wary book coming out this summer in July, as far as I know. Hopefully by July, everything will be, I don't know, it probably won't be back to normal, but things will be different than they are right now, hopefully. The new Roxanne Wary book is called Once You Go Too Far, and it is the fourth one in the series, and I'm really excited to be able to launch that. It is set partially in Columbus, and also a part of it is up in Toledo, so Roxanne is kind of on the move. Joanna says, hopefully people are reading more while at home. I certainly hope so. There's only so much television you can watch, I suppose. Like, I don't know if you remember, there used to be, like, back in the late 90s, there was this commercial that it still makes me laugh when I think about it. There's this guy clicking around on his computer, and then the screen says, "You have reached the end of the internet. Goodbye." I don't even know what it was a commercial for, honestly. Probably internet service. But sometimes I worry, like, are we going to reach that point of Netflix? Like, well, I watched all of Netflix. So, if that does happen, people can turn to books, which is a very, very good thing. Dan says, have you considered pandemic noir? I feel like that is the logical next book in the Akashic series when all of this is cleared up, like stories about people trapped in their homes with each other during this time. I definitely think there is something there. Andrew says, who is your assistant? That is probably my cat Snapple, who she was behind me in the kitchen making a lot of noise a little bit ago. But she seems to have gone now. But the cats are usually around. Let's see. Joanna says, where do you imagine Anya lives in relation to Roxanne's apartment? Oh, interesting question. So, my protagonist in my series, Roxanne Weary, she also lives on Bryden Road, which is kind of the main thoroughfare through Old Town. And Roxanne actually lives in, like, I picture her in an apartment where I used to live, which was on Bryden and 22nd. So sort of, like right smack in the middle, I would say, of the blocks that encompass Old Town. And Anya's place, I would say, is closer to Wilson on Bryden Road. So if you drive up and down Bryden Road, you'll see a lot of sort of these apartment buildings where there's, 4 units in the building, 2 on the first floor, 2 on the second floor. They all have big brick porches. So you look at them and they're just kind of like big brick squares with like cutouts in them. That was a place kind of like that. But then mixed in with all these apartment buildings, there's just these huge houses. And a lot of them have been restored and are just breathtaking. There are quite a few that are in disrepair and ripe for people like Anya and Eli to decide that they would like to fix up. Pam would like to know who were my favorite fictional female characters when I was a girl. Oh my goodness, what an interesting question. I don't think anyone's ever asked me that before. Well, I was deeply obsessed with Law and Order when I was a child. I was a weird kid. So was a big fan of Claire Kincaid. And I read a lot of Nancy Drew as well. I don't actually know that I gravitated towards books with female protagonists for some reason. I think I was so interested in reading mysteries that I sort of like that was sort of where I went. But I wish that I could like go back in time and hand my younger self some reading material with better, more age-appropriate themes. Eileen, who is my mother, says, "Still are. Yes, I still am a weird child. That is that is no secret." Oh yes, and Katie reminds me, the X-Files, Dana Scully. How could I forget? Yeah, Dana Scully is a really great character because, especially at that time, like she was a scientist. She was tough. She was such a badass. Her character wasn't written to be like overtly feminine or sexualized. Like in her 90s shoulder pads with her fluffy hair, like that was a look. But yeah, the X-Files was definitely something that I was obsessed with. Jessica says, "Can I please make my next protagonist a cat?" Listen, don't tempt me. When I was a kid, one of my favorite books was called Sam the Cat Detective. And it was about a cat named Sam who was a detective. And he solves a mystery of who stole a jade necklace. And it is like, it's one of those books where like, as a kid, I just liked it because it had cats in it. But like as an adult, when I've revisited it, which I have, it's a really, really good like sort of parody on the way that sort of hard-boiled PI novels were written, Raymond Chandler, that kind of thing. Just shrunk down to be for middle grade readers and about a cat. It's great. Let's see. Andrew says, "What advice would you give writers right now who are struggling to get through all of this, whether with creativity, productivity, or just keeping spirits up?" Such a good question. So important. And I think that one thing is being a writer is not an easy business, even in non-pandemic times. So this is sort of just like practice for how it's going to be even when this is over. Publishing won't go back to being easy all of a sudden. Like it's never easy. So it's automatically a tough business, but ultimately it's about the writing. It's about, doing what you love to do, which is telling a story. And if you are feeling sort of stuck and uncertain of how to get over your stress or anxiety, or just, feeling overwhelmed and freaked out and not at all creative, I would definitely suggest try something totally different. Like if you're writing a novel and it's not working, write a 2-minute long play, bake a cake, knit a sweater, sew a face mask, something else that is creative, but it's a different kind of creative that has often helped me sort of shake things loose. And as far as productivity goes, like I definitely feel that, not having that drive to be efficient, because like every 5 minutes kind of have to stop and be like, oh no, this is all terrible. Like it's really hard to get a lot of work done. And I think that we really have to be gentle and kind with ourselves and have it be okay that we're not getting a lot of work done right now. We're not machines. We're human beings. We are delicate, sensitive creatures, and like we really just have to go easy because it's not possible to pretend like everything is normal right now. It's not. So that's what I would say. Let's see. Lisa says, if you sell the movie rights, who would you want to play Roxanne? Well, in my mind, Roxanne looks like Jennifer Connelly from like the 2004 era. If anyone has seen the film House of Sand and Fog, which is one of my favorite movies, Jennifer Connelly's look in that movie is exactly how I picture Roxanne Weary. Yep. Okay, well, I'm really happy that so many people came to listen to me, blabber about my book and about Columbus Noir. It is an awesome collection. All of the stories in it are fantastic. And it's available in print and ebook editions anywhere books are sold, including through the Akashic Books website. Your favorite online retailer and local independent bookstores who could definitely use your help and are still shipping books, such as The Book Loft, Gramercy, Prologue Bookshop, Paragraphs Bookstore in Mount Vernon, Main Street Books in Mansfield, just to name a few. And if you need to find an indie bookstore in a different area, check out indiebound.org. They will point you to bookstores that are near you that are selling books. So grab your copy, buy a bunch of other books too, because reading is awesome. Thank you so much for joining me. Bye.